Welcome to another Big Train Tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. Today, we'll be taking a look at Colorado and Southern Caboose number 1009. This interesting narrow-gauge way car dates to 1882 and the early days of the legendary South Park Line's expansion in Colorado. Acquired by the museum in 1961 as just a body, this rare survivor has been restored to operating condition and is today proudly displayed in Golden. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Our subject today is a diminutive four-wheel narrow-gauge bobber caboose built in the shops of its parent railroad. Like many rail vehicles from the 19th century, Caboose number 1009 started its life with a different appearance, and it was known as a way car for its first 2 to 3 decades of service. Renumbered several times during its life, it was rebuilt and modernized, then retired and almost lost. Its very existence today provides a powerful connection with Colorado freight railroading, changes in the railroad safety environment, and the many railroad workers who have helped shape the expansion and settlement of the Centennial State. The railroad caboose today remains a treasured icon in children's literature and popular American culture. But even though an end-of-train car for crews has existed almost from the beginning of American railroading in the 1830s, it took several decades for cabooses to take on the familiar appearance we think of today. Exactly when American freight trains began carrying a caboose is unknown, but an often cited account, which claims to be the first use of a caboose in the United States, comes from Uncle Nat Williams, a conductor with New York's Auburn and Syracuse Railroad. Williams used an empty boxcar at the end of a freight train for his office, complete with a wood box for a chair and a barrel for a desk. Other early cabooses were nothing more than flat cars with small cabins erected on them. These would have resembled the cook shack on a ship's deck, and it's possible that the very word caboose is derived from 18th century Dutch, French, or English words meaning cook's shack. Whatever its form, the caboose was created to provide shelter for those members of the train crew who were based at the tail end of a train, typically a conductor along with one or more rear brakemen, rather than being based in the locomotive at the train's head end. So what does all of this have to do with our way car or caboose anyway? In the 19th century, freight trains typically had brakemen assigned to the rear of the train, as well as to the front. Those forward brakemen assigned to the front of the train would likely find refuge in the engine cab until they were called into action. Those stationed at the back also needed a place to ride, however, and so too did the train's conductor. The way car or caboose was the place for these trainmen to find refuge from the weather, and also to remain vigilant and observe the train as the trip progressed. On a mixed train, where there were freight cars and one or more passenger cars in the consist, a separate caboose was not needed. In general, this approach worked well so long as the train was only carrying 2 or 3 freight cars. Mixed train passengers often endured delays as these freight cars were dropped off and picked up en route. Thus, mixed trains tended to run only on less trafficked branch lines. Another reason cabooses caught on was because passenger cars were often not compatible with the needs of freight train crews. Particularly for longer trains, the conductor needed a table or desk to do his work, which was keeping precise records of the cargoes carried. The rear brakemen needed a place to get out of the weather when they were not switching or coupling cars or applying handbrakes. These brakemen sometimes were rough-mannered and not always the best companions for ticketed passengers. Cupolas are another feature long associated with cabooses. T.B. Watson, a conductor with the Chicago and Northwestern, is credited with creating the first cupola caboose in 1863. The idea caught on because it provided a vantage point from which to inspect the train while it was in motion, allowing for visual identification of problems such as shifting loads, derailments, and overheated axle bearings known as hotboxes. It would take a while, however, for the cupola itself to evolve into a more or less typical appearance. Interesting variations could still be found in service well into the 20th century, including cabooses without cupolas. Cabooses weren't always called cabooses. Several major U.S. railroads including the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, and the Pennsylvania Railroad used other terms, including way car and cabin car. Here in Colorado, most railroads seem to have called their freight train crew cars cabooses. But our subject today started its service career as one of those exceptions, being built as a way car for the Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railroad. Founded in 1872 by former Colorado Territorial Governor John Evans, the 3-foot narrow-gauge South Park line opened up the first rail routes to a wide swath of central Colorado mining districts in the early decades of the state's mineral boom. However, for the first several years after its founding, the railroad managed only to build a branch line to the town of Morrison due to bad economic conditions following the Panic of 1873. The South Park's main line from Denver, which finally got underway starting in the late 1870s, would ascend the scenic Platte River Canyon to the summit of Kenosha Pass. This was reached by 1879, and after summiting the pass, the line entered a vast open area known as South Park. In doing so, this railroad gained its moniker, the South Park Line, by which the line would be known even as its corporate ownership changed over time. The year 1879 was big for the South Park Line. A mining boom near Leadville resulted in a race between the Denver, South Park, and Pacific and the Denver and Rio Grande railroads. Both lines reached Buena Vista by 1880, with the Rio Grande's tracks following the Arkansas River out of Pueblo towards their headwaters, and the South Park's tracks traversing its namesake park to Trout Creek Pass, then heading downgrade along Trout Creek to Buena Vista. From there, the two railroads had already agreed to share a single track north to Leadville, rather than building separate, parallel lines. That line was completed by the Denver and Rio Grande later the same year. Also in 1879, the South Park Line signed contracts for construction of its planned Alpine Tunnel, which would enable the railroad to reach the promising Gunnison mining district. Construction took much longer and was more difficult than expected. Thus, Gunnison was not reached until 1882. In the meantime, starting in 1880, the South Park Line had come under the control of the Union Pacific Railway, although the line continued to operate independently. In 1884, to complicate matters somewhat, the Denver and Rio Grande canceled the shared trackage agreement between Buena Vista and Leadville. This necessitated that the South Park Line construct a new route starting from Como in South Park, up over Boreas Pass to Breckenridge, then north to Dillon, Keystone, and Frisco, turning south and west to climb up and over Fremont Pass, then finally dropping down to reach Leadville. Despite its lofty goals, the South Park Line never connected to the Pacific. Its primary connections with other railroads were made at its terminal and yards immediately to the south and west of Denver Union Station. However, the railroad would gain fame far beyond its mileage because of the rugged river canyons it followed and the multiple mountain passes it crossed. 3 of these over the Continental Divide, in the process of reaching its 2 main destinations of Leadville and Gunnison. The line went bankrupt in 1889 and was reorganized under a new corporate name as the Denver, Leadville, and Gunnison Railway. During this time, our subject caboose was relettered and renumbered, but otherwise no changes seem apparent. When parent company Union Pacific itself went bankrupt in 1893, the Denver, Leadville, and Gunnison lines went into receivership. They remained in this state for several years, then were finally sold to the newly formed Colorado and Southern Railway as the 19th century drew to a close. Our subject caboose was originally known as a way car. It dates from 1882, and since Union Pacific by that time was the South Park Line's owner, it was home built to standard plans at the UP's Omaha, Nebraska shops. This short 4-wheeled bobber car was pretty much identical to other way cars that had been built earlier, beginning in the late 1870s at the South Park's main workshops in downtown Denver. When placed in service, this way car carried the number 78. It became part of a small fleet of over a dozen way cars on the South Park Line. Little number 78 had a body that measures just under 13 feet long. Including the car's 2 end platforms, its total length was 18 feet 9 inches, and it was constructed completely of wood with steel and iron used sparingly in places such as the end platform railings, wheels and axles, and suspension. The car's journal pedestal assemblies were spaced just 9 feet apart on center, and the as-built suspension system employed a combination of springs, equalizer bars, and cross braces. These way cars were undoubtedly rough riding, but thankfully the trains they rode behind were not known to go terribly fast. Equipped with a coal stove for heat, the main feature that way car number 78 lacked was a cupola. The separate Colorado Central narrow gauge line, running between Denver and Golden and continuing on to Black Hawk and Central City, seems to have started the trend, building virtually identical way cars in the mid-1870s. Although competitor Denver and Rio Grande's earliest cabooses featured cupolas from the early 1870s, the South Park Line's first way cars, dating from the late 1870s, followed the Colorado Central's model. Cupolas would not be added until the early 20th century to these way cars, and thus until that time they would not be referred to as cabooses. As a way car, number 78 is believed to have been painted a straw yellow color with mineral red frame and underbody, which was similar to the appearance of Union Pacific cabooses at this time. The car journeyed all across the South Park Line, together with its siblings, bringing up the rear of freight trains running between Denver, Como, and Leadville, even through the ill-fated Alpine Tunnel to Gunnison. These way cars were used when photographer William Henry Jackson rode along the line and photographed glass plate images of the incredible scenery. They could also be found as part of the line's snow fighting trains in wintertime, providing sleeping quarters for crew members during long trips to clear the line of frequent, deep snowfalls. In 1885, the railroad's locomotives and cars went through a complete renumbering by parent company Union Pacific, which was seeking to eliminate duplication of car numbers across the numerous subsidiary lines that it controlled. Way car number 78 was renumbered to 1516 at this time, but otherwise it continued in service unchanged. Curiously, photographs of these cars during the 1880s and even into the 1890s show that they were painted different colors during their Union Pacific years, and lettering wasn't consistent either. The car's new number likely wasn't applied for several years, even though it had changed on paper. In 1889, the Union Pacific reorganized the Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railroad into a new Denver, Leadville, and Gunnison. This reorganization kept the company from going into financial receivership, thus keeping it a Union Pacific-controlled property. Although way car 1516 retained its number on the newly renamed railroad, just 4 years later, the Panic of 1893 caused new financial stresses on the struggling railroad. A court appointed an out-of-state group of men with ties to the Union Pacific as receivers, but the line's founder and former Colorado Territorial Governor John Evans, who still held stock in the company, successfully sued to have the railroad removed from Union Pacific control. As receivership came to an end in 1898, a new company, the Colorado and Southern Railway, was organized by the bondholders. It took possession at the beginning of 1899, starting a whole new era. The newly created Colorado and Southern system incorporated both standard gauge and narrow gauge lines running in Wyoming, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Texas. The railroad operating environment of the 19th century was quite primitive compared to today. Especially in the Colorado Rockies, trains were typically short and early steam locomotives not all that powerful. When pulling a train up a steep grade, locomotive driving wheels would slip, or the engine simply couldn't budge the train if too much tonnage was added. When coming downhill, the speed of the descending train had to be closely controlled. The South Park's trains and way cars were not equipped with air brakes in the line's early days. The locomotive engineer had only cylinder back pressure, as well as a single handbrake on the locomotive's tender at his immediate command. These two means were far from sufficient to stop a heavy train on a steep mountain grade. Brakes needed to be applied on each individual car by hand. When the engineer needed to slow the train or to stop, he would signal his crew to do the work of applying the brakes. A whistle signal was most commonly used because any other kind of signal might well have gone unnoticed. But no matter what the signal, the brakeman did the actual work of applying the brakes, by hand, one car at a time. In 1880, the South Park equipped its trains with Eames vacuum brake systems. The air for this system was sucked under vacuum pressure from cylinders on each car by an ejector on the train's steam locomotive. This in turn created vacuum, or reverse pressure, that was used to apply the brakes on each car. Unfortunately, at higher altitudes such as those found on the South Park line, atmospheric pressure decreases and thus vacuum braking power is less effective. The system also had no backup in case of a break in the vacuum line or a pull apart of the train. In a move unusual for a small railroad such as the South Park, the railroad switched to Westinghouse automatic air brakes just a few years later. By 1884, the railroad was fully equipped with air brakes, except for its cabooses, interestingly. This quick turnaround appears to have been related to Union Pacific ownership. The UP itself had adopted vacuum brakes in the early 1880s, only to announce 2 years later that air brakes would be applied to all of its freight cars system-wide, beginning with the Denver, South Park, and Pacific. This adoption was way in advance of when air brakes would be mandated for all U.S. railroads. Another operating challenge was couplers. The link and pin coupling system was standard on the South Park Line's freight cars from the 1880s through the early 1900s. Brakemen worked with the engine crew to push cars into position and then lift up the link to guide it into a pocket and drop the pin into the link at precisely the correct moment. Uncoupling was just as challenging. Sight lines were pretty much non-existent at critical times, so many things could, and did, go wrong. Any miscalculation or error on the brakeman's part could result in the loss of a finger, the amputation of a hand or leg, or death. Inside the caboose or way car, brakemen did their best to watch the train ahead for any signs of overheating axle bearings, dragging brakes, derailment, or other danger. The lack of a cupola made this somewhat difficult on the South Park line. After the advent of air brakes, brakemen would also monitor the main brake pipe pressure gauge mounted inside the caboose. Any drop in pressure could spell trouble and impede the train's stopping ability. In this environment, not surprisingly, multiple brakemen were assigned to each train. This was one of the most dangerous jobs in the country, as well as one of the most popular. It was dangerous because it was easy to be thrown off the tops of cars, or to fall overboard while yanking on a brake wheel with a stick, or to lose a digit or a limb to link and pin couplers. Railroad work was some of the most dangerous in the 19th century, and the job of brakeman was the most dangerous occupation in the U.S. Yet the job was popular because it could lead to promotion and advancement. With the inception of the new Colorado and Southern Railway in 1899, way car number 1516 was once again renumbered, this time to CNS number 312. In 1908, the Colorado and Southern was acquired by the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. Although this gave the smaller CNS new reach into a much greater territory, the railroad's attitude towards its narrow gauge lines immediately changed for the worse. This is understandable when considering that freight revenues on the former South Park lines made up less than 5% of the entire CNS system. In 1910, the company closed Alpine Tunnel and embargoed the line from South Park through Trout Creek Canyon to Buena Vista, with the result that Gunnison was now exclusively Denver and Rio Grande territory. The Colorado and Southern also attempted to close its line over Boreas Pass at this same time, although it was forced to reopen the pass in 1913 after the Breckenridge Chamber of Commerce sued the company in court. Major shifts in the railroad safety environment were taking place during the Colorado and Southern Railway's first decade. Congress, spurred on by railroad workers and concerned citizens, had dictated that air brakes and so-called automatic couplers would become standard equipment on the country's railroads by the turn of the 20th century. The South Park countered by fighting the coupler mandate, claiming to be an intrastate rather than an interstate railroad. The state of Colorado responded by passing its own legislation requiring the new couplers. So by 1903, the line's rolling stock was mostly compliant, except for the line's cabooses. Although most South Park rolling stock used air brakes starting in the mid-1880s, the line's way cars or cabooses remained handbrake equipped for another 2 decades, partly due to the difficulty of installing the new brake system in combination with the original suspensions, which utilized a spiderweb of equalizers, sway bars, and cross braces. Sometime between 1903 and 1907, shop crews upgraded the undercarriages of the cabooses and way cars, with their pedestals now being independently sprung, and they installed air brakes. Safety regulations broadened to mandate ladders and grab irons and roof walks for crew safety by 1913, so these too were updated and improved to comply. Another major improvement in the early years of the 20th century was legislation limiting the number of hours that could be worked in a single shift. Although the job of brakeman remained a hard-working one, the risk of death or injury began to decline noticeably. Several years after the Colorado and Southern assumed control of the South Park line, a cupola was added to one end of our subject way car, and it was renumbered one final time, becoming Caboose 1009. It would sport this number for the rest of its service career. We still don't know exactly when the cupola was added, but the renumbering itself occurred in 1912, possibly in combination with other safety upgrades, including the cupola. No longer known as a way car, Caboose number 1009 continued to travel across the Colorado and Southern narrow gauge system. This included the former Colorado Central and later Union Pacific Denver and Gulf lines from Denver and Golden to Central City, Blackhawk, and Silver Plume. This last destination reached via the famed Georgetown Loop. Caboose 1009 appears to have worked across all of the system at various times, and was equally at home traveling along Clear Creek above Golden, or the Platte River to Kenosha Pass, Como, and Leadville. Beginning in the late 1920s, the movement of molybdenum ore to Denver from a new mine at Climax, near the summit of Fremont Pass above Leadville, became increasingly important to the Colorado and Southern. This in turn meant the line up the South Platte River to Como, then up and over Boreas Pass to Leadville, remained important. In 1936, the Climax mine caused an additional traffic surge when it ordered millions of pounds of structural steel, lumber, cement, and other building materials for a major facility expansion. 3 locomotives were rented from the Denver and Rio Grande Western to help with the surge, including number 346, today preserved in operating condition at the Colorado Railroad Museum. Caboose number 1009, for its last few years, was assigned to Leadville. But as traffic declined and the Colorado and Southern's narrow gauge routes were slowly abandoned, the route's cabooses, including number 1009, were retired one by one. In 1938, the South Park's line to Leadville was abandoned, excepting the portion between Leadville and Climax, which was kept in service. When this isolated narrow gauge line was converted to standard gauge operation in 1943, Caboose 1009 was part of the very last narrow gauge train. The Colorado and Southern's Clear Creek lines between Idaho Springs and Silver Plume, as well as the branch to Blackhawk, would themselves be abandoned in 1939, and the line between Golden and Idaho Springs followed suit in 1941. The narrow gauge third rail between Denver and Golden went at this time, as it was no longer needed, although the branch line to Golden and the Coors Brewery remains important and in service today. Our subject caboose was dismantled at Leadville in 1943, stripped of its wheel sets and underbody mechanical gear. The car body was then sold off to a farm in Buena Vista, where it served as a shed until the early 1960s. Luckily, Colorado Railroad Museum founder Bob Richardson had kept his eye on this car and its whereabouts. Knowing that only one other former South Park caboose was known to remain, displayed in Silver Plume, Richardson arranged for the Colorado Railroad Museum in 1961 to purchase the dilapidated car body. It was loaded onto a trailer in Buena Vista and transported to Golden, Colorado in April. A first round of renovations gave number 1009 running gear and mostly, but not entirely accurate, replacement wheel sets, pedestals, and springs. The car celebrated a return to service at the museum in June 1966, being pulled behind Denver and Rio Grande Western steam locomotive number 346 for a steam-up. Repainted several times over the next 3 decades, sometimes in bright red colors that were a bit more striking than the original. The car turns up in photographs taken throughout the museum's rail yard throughout the 1990s. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Caboose 1009 saw a good deal of woodwork repaired or replaced and a new coat of paint applied. During that time, the museum's shop crews often painted cars with different appearances on each side, sometimes confusing photographers. When completed, the car sported its post-renumbering 19-teens appearance on one side and its later and final Colorado and Southern appearance on the other. In 2022, Caboose 1009 was once again brought into the museum's Cornelius Houck Roundhouse Restoration Facility for repairs. The end platforms were sagging, and one required replacement. Roof repairs and platform woodwork were well underway when an unexpected discovery was made. The project turned into a larger than anticipated effort, requiring removal of asbestos by a contractor from the wall behind its coal stove. The removal in turn revealed damage from an earlier fire. With the surprises addressed, crews finished off the renovations by repainting and relettering number 1009 to represent its later appearance on the Colorado and Southern. Completed in spring 2023, the project has given new life to this pioneering caboose, originally known as a way car and lacking that seemingly universal feature, a cupola, for its first 2 or 3 decades of service. Thanks for joining me today. Diminutive Caboose number 1009 today continues to serve as an icon of Colorado freight railroading, and its evolution from a more primitive way car highlights the many changes to the railroad safety environment that took place in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Its lengthy career on the famed South Park line serves as a connection to not only the railroad, but also the many railroad workers who helped shape the expansion and settlement of the Centennial State. I hope you've enjoyed our tour of Colorado and Southern Caboose number 1009 and the many changes it saw during its 6 decades of service. I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collection.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.